Hurricane Irma, one of the strongest storms on record in the Atlantic Basin, and we may not be done with this storm in terms of its intensity continuing to grow, and it's just starting to make its impacts on land. The northern Lesser Antilles feeling the brunt of the storm here on your Tuesday evening, and as we head through your Wednesday, it's going to be into Puerto Rico. Then we're talking about the Dominican. Then we're talking about the U.S., the U.K., Virgin Islands. Then we're talking about, the Turks and Caicos. Then potentially the Bahamas and possible U.S. impacts. Long ways to go here.
Long ways to go over a period of the next 6 to 7 days. Exponentially now toward the end. Sometimes it can be off. If we're off a mile or two at the beginning, it's exponential toward the end. So keep that in mind. That's why all interests, even into the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, you should be paying attention to what happens here by the hour here pretty soon as it gets closer by the weekend. We have with us, and we have had for quite a while now, the Deputy Director of Public Affairs for the Air Force Reconnaissance and Reserve, Chad Gibson, Lieutenant Colonel Chad Gibson, who joins us now with some information again. We've been talking a lot about these trips into the eye of this hurricane, getting some of the details about that, Lieutenant Colonel. And we're talking about now NOAA. You said NOAA's flying tonight. Tell us what's the difference.
Well, the Air Force Reserve has WC-130J Super Hercules aircraft made by Lockheed Martin that flies into the storm no higher than 10,000 feet. Now, they typically do the operational data collecting that goes straight to the Hurricane Center that makes their forecast 30 to 35% more accurate. NOAA has hurricane hunters. They fly P-3 Orions, also made by Lockheed Martin. They do a lot of research. They fly at different levels. They collect very critical data for research. But when you get a storm like this, when you're wanting to get constant surveillance, they will also fly some operational missions as well. And the last vortex message that we looked at did come from the P-3 Orion from NOAA. But a majority of the data collection is done by the Air Force Reserve.
Lieutenant Colonel, I'm going to ask you to clarify me if I'm incorrect with this one, but I believe that the hurricane hunters started going in there back over the weekend into the storm, and that's when the track started to shift from perhaps going out to sea to a bit more of that due westerly track. Do you attribute some of that to the information gathered by the hurricane hunters in terms of that improved forecasting off towards the west?
Absolutely. The reserve citizen airmen that fly into the fury of Mother Nature are collecting vital life-saving data that will affect where that track goes as it puts into the models from the National Hurricane Center. Now, keep in mind, we're data collectors, and the Hurricane Center are the experts in forecasting. But it definitely makes a big difference. When you see landfall, expand that cone of a potential landfall by 35%, you're talking, anywhere from 50 to 100 miles in some cases. And that at a cost of $1 million per mile. That's a lot of cost, but also more, it saves lives because people believe that forecast.
Yeah, Chad, I've known you for a long, long time. I know you've been flying into these things for many years, over 1,000 hours of flight time inside of these hurricanes. Is this one, you didn't fly this, but I know you've been talking to, getting information from people who have been flying this. What's unique about it?
I think just the intensity of it. You're approaching pressure levels that are very low. Back in 2005, which was when Katrina and just a long series of very strong hurricanes were back to back across the Gulf Coast. You saw Wilma that hit in Florida that had the record low pressure. You're starting to see some of these pressures really get low to that. I think it's just very well organized. And the eye itself is very large in diameter, about 20 nautical miles. And with a pressure that low and the eye that wide, that's a very strong storm. So you have to be very careful, take this very, very seriously if you're anywhere in the projected path.
Deputy Director of Public Affairs for the Air Force Reserve, Lieutenant Colonel Chad Gibson. Chad, thank you so much for all you've done to help us out with some of this information. Absolutely. And we'll be talking to you periodically through the next week as it gets closer and closer to the U.S. mainland as well. Now moving on to the west at a fairly decent clip, 15 miles per hour now with a forward motion, winds at 185, Chris. And this is getting now ever so close to Antigua and St. Croix eventually, and then into Puerto Rico during the early part of the day tomorrow.
On that forecast track, then we start getting those questions as to whether we're going to be talking about U.S. impacts. Mandatory evacuations in place throughout Key West, and the airport will be closing down tomorrow night for commercial use as well. We're going to be tracking it on the ground, though. Brent Adair, meteorologist Brent Adair in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Eric Fox in St. Thomas. More on Irma after this.